I'm so excited for this morning. I get to continue our series as we talk about rings. And again, you probably have found out by now, if you haven't watched the series yet, you're finding out now, it doesn't have anything to do with rings on your fingers. It doesn't have anything to do with gold or diamond rings, even though people have gone out and bought them just for the series, like Rebecca. But that has happened, and that's okay, but it doesn't have anything to do with rings per se. What it has to do is with words that end with rings. So we've gone through a few already, but the first few that we have, just to kind of recap the series a little bit, is we did surviving suffering. Pastor Craig talked about surviving suffering, how we get through that. We talked about halting the hindering, as we talked about how women maybe have been halted in ministry and in leadership in the church. That was a great message. You got to go back and watch that. And then last week we talked about what is the future offering, as we talked about giving. We talked about generosity. So you're gonna want to go back and watch those messages. But I got a ring for you today that doesn't sit well with us and is something that we struggle with, but it's something that probably none of us really ever should struggle with, but yet we do. But I want to confess something a little bit this morning. I feel like I often start my messages confessing something. I just think it's a great way. This is my time to get stuff off my chest. But I want to say something that I think I'm a little bit boring. And maybe you're like looking at me, you're like, yeah, you're definitely boring. You're definitely a boring man. But I want to say that I think I'm a little bit boring. I've kind of come to this realization, and maybe I should have come to it sooner. But I came to when I was a young adult. People would ask me, what do you like to do? And I was like, well, I like to exercise, and I like to read, and I like to play board games, and I like to watch movies. And I'm like, wow, none of those things are like overtly exciting. Like none of those things are really like something you'd say, that's an interesting individual. There were things that I'm like, yeah, I'm a middle-aged white man who likes those things, and that makes me a little bit boring, and that's okay. So I think I'm a little bit boring, and I've come to terms with that. But as Pastor Craig is taking this kind of much-deserved weekend off, I want to talk about that idea of boring. And I think when we talk about this, it's important to ask ourselves, and I want to ask you this morning, are you boring? Are you boring? And before you get all defensive, I think we have like a lot of ideas about what boring is, and we're going to get into that. But maybe you got defensive and you're thinking like, I'm not boring. I try to fill my schedule. I do lots of things. I do a lot of different things. I'm not boring. But I think it's important for us to consider that. Do we feel bad about being boring? And I think our Western culture kind of puts the pressure on us to not be boring. To not be boring. We need to be exciting. We need to be just filling our schedules with stuff, and we need to have things going on, but we can't be boring. Like social media, for example, it just says we need to show ourselves off. Like we need to do lots of things. We need to show all the interesting things that we're doing. So our Instagram and our Facebook, our photos become kind of like a highlight reel. We're just showing off, like, look at all the things that I'm doing. We post vacation photos. Even if we didn't go on one recently, we'll say, hey, throwback, I went on a vacation like a year ago, or hey, I did this cool thing like 3-4 years ago. Like we do throwbacks in order to kind of make it look like, yeah, I am still interesting. I am still an interesting person. I'm not boring. And we almost kind of give off this impression because we have this pressure of social media to kind of do that. But even when we're boring, we even try to give the impression that we're not. We'll post things like we'll be watching some new show and be like, hey, I'm watching like Tiger King or something like that. Just throwing it back to pre-pandemic or the beginning of pandemic. But even we'll post things like, oh, I'm sitting on my new deck that I just renovated and all these things. Like those aren't exactly the most exciting things, yet we like to like make them exciting somehow. And I'm so guilty of this too. Oftentimes I'll be looking at my social media and I'm just like, okay, so like I haven't posted anything for like a month, like since my daughter was born. What should I post? Do I post just another picture of my kid just sitting there eating a snack, or do I like post a picture of like something I did a year? Like I don't know what to post. Like I don't know what to post because I'm like, is this interesting? I don't know. I'm a boring person, and is that okay? I don't know. But these are the things I ask myself. I'm like, what should I even post? And maybe you don't have those problems, and that's okay. I'm glad you don't have those problems, but I know there's a significant amount of people that maybe you just feel this pressure that you need to be exciting. And maybe if you don't have those problems on social media, you might have those at work. Like someone asks, like, hey, what did you do this past week? Or what did you do? And you're just like, I sat at home and I binged another episode. Or actually, I didn't do a new episode, or new season. I just rewatched The Office for like the 15th time. But you're throwing it back and you're trying to just kind of give off this impression. I'm like, yeah, interesting. Like, this is what I did. These are the things that I do. But I think sometimes we need to ease the pressure off just a little bit. Because I think for most of us, we like what's exciting. We like what's fast. We like what's innovative and new. We like novel things that are exciting, that are happening. We like fast food. We want to know, like, what's going to give me a thrill? Like, what's really going to excite me? What's going to get my blood pumping? But I want to talk a little bit about the word boring. The word boring, it actually comes from something called a boring tool. And I got a few things here that I want to show you. We have something called a boring tool. It's not this drill. That's for later. I'm going to leave that over there. But this boring tool, it looks like this. And it's probably looked like a lot different through the centuries and everything. But this thing has existed for years, like centuries, maybe millennia. Like at some point, it was probably maybe just like a little pick that you just kept kind of chipping away at, like a piece of rock or something. But boring tools have existed forever. But this is where the word boring comes from. It was in about like late 1700s, the word boring kind of came into relevance. And what it had to do was it was referring to a boring tool, because if you look at it, this is a boring tool. This is what it does. It just kind of goes into the wood, and you just grab it, and you just turn it. It's a little squeaky, because it's been turning a lot. But it just goes in, and it just slowly bores a hole in the wood. Just slowly bores it in. And it takes a long time. There's probably more efficient ways of this to happen. There's probably more efficient ways, like there's drills, there's things that we have where we can put a hole into something a lot quicker. But this is why they call it boring, because it's a little boring to keep turning something over and over, especially if you had to do multiple holes. Like, it takes a long time. It takes a long time, and it's just over and over again. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. But this is a boring tool, and it's slow, it's repetitive, you just turn it around and around and around again. So people, when they look at this, is like this is like a tedious task. Like, no one really wanted to do it, so they started saying that's boring. That's like boring. So out of that, we got the terms bore, where we call someone a bore. We're like, oh, you're such a bore because you're like this. You're just boring. Or they would say something's like boredom, because it's like a boring tool. It's like when you're boring, so we call it's boredom. But that's where the word came from. Maybe you didn't know that, but it comes from a boring tool in the late 1700s. But when we see this tool, there's no variation in it. It's a little bit sometimes like what we would call boring. Like, if we lived a boring life, it's like we wake up, we get dressed, we eat food. Maybe it's the same food you ate for the past 5 days. You're still eating that same bowl of Cheerios every single day of the week. And you get up, you go to work, you take the same way to work every single day. You get to work, maybe you have a pretty repetitive job that does the exact same thing every single day, and you do it over and over and again. You go home, and then you have probably a very similar meal. Maybe it's just some boiled chicken or something. That was something that I did because I'm boring. But we go home, and you have that food, and then you maybe watch that same show you've been watching, and you're binging that season of Office again, you're watching it again, and then you go to bed and you do it all over again. And this can kind of become a little bit like our life. It's boring. It's just, you're just living life. You're not doing anything different. There's no variation. It's just the same thing. It's cyclical. It's just the same thing over and over and over again. So you can see why people started to call things like this boring. You can see why they started to do that. But it was just like this. And in our culture, we are increasingly obsessed with doing more. We need to do more things faster, better. It needs to be more efficient, more productive. We think, how can we pack more things into my schedule? How can I make my schedule more packed? We often ask the question, what can we fit in, not what can we cut out? How can I simplify my schedule? And this goes into our work, into our families, and so much more. Like, this is everything. But we have bought into the lie, and this is important, we've bought into the lie that the more we hustle, the more we do, the better off that we'll be. I'll say it again. We bought into the lie that the more we hustle, the more we do, the better off we'll be. And I don't think that's true. I don't think that that's true. John Mark Comer, he has this quote in his book called I'm not exactly sure of the title. Maybe someone knows that you've read it. I don't want to say it wrong, so I'm not going to say it right now. But he quotes this, John Mark Comer. He says this: "The modern world is a virtual conspiracy against the interior life. The modern world is a virtual conspiracy against the interior life. And I love that quote because it's almost like the modern world, like all of these things that we're doing, all of these things that are happening, that we have all these tasks and things that we're doing. It is like this conspiracy against the interior life, which is really where we are formed, where life happens, where we are human beings, not human doings, as maybe you've heard it said. But there's these things that we do all these things, and it's almost like a conspiracy against like who we really are and how we develop as a person. We almost forget that. It's almost like all of the things we do are almost like a distraction from what's happening in our heads and our minds. Like you think of like TV shows, of everything. It's almost like it's meant to put us on autopilot. You think of scrolling over and over again. It's like it's putting you on autopilot. But we stress ourselves out about trying to be productive when achieving 100% efficiency and productivity was never really God's desire for us. That wasn't his plan. But perhaps we do so because maybe we actually care more about what others think. We care about what others think more than what God thinks. So we try to do more in order to please them, in order to do what is expected of us. We might watch a TV show simply because that's what our friends are watching and we want to be relevant with them and be up with the conversations with them. Maybe we do certain tasks and activities. We go on vacations or camping simply because like that's what you're supposed to do. Maybe you don't actually necessarily enjoy it even, or it doesn't even really bring you rest, but you just do it because that's what's expected. Maybe you do a lot of things in your life because it's just simply what like friends, what everyone else in your life is doing. It's just these expectations if you're actually just trying to please others and not God. But maybe it's not that we're obsessed with achievement and productivity, but maybe that's how we feel like we are valued in this Western culture. That if we're not productive, if we don't achieve, then we're not valuable. And we need to produce. And in order for us to do that in like a post-industrial revolution kind of world, we need to produce in order to be seen as valuable. If we look at God and Jesus being someone that we should emulate, and Jesus being God, is God focused on achievement and productivity, or is God kind of, boring? I think that's a good question for us to ask. And maybe you're like, what do you mean by that? Is God boring? Like, God's not boring or anything. I know there's people who are kind of commenting on this message, kind of leading up to this, that they weren't sure what we were going to talk about. Or like, hey, you're going to talk about boring, but you're going to say that God's not boring, right? Like, you're going to say that he, like the world thinks that he's boring, but you're going to say he's not boring, right? So I'm going to say that I think God might be a little bit boring. And we're going to talk about that. If we look at God, and Jesus being that, we look at Jesus. Jesus spent less than 10% of his life on carrying out God's grand redemptive mission of mankind. 10% of his life. Jesus was the Son of God. He was God in the flesh. And he spent only 10% of his life really carrying out this grand redemptive mission. But even of that 10%, like he still slept, he still spent time going off on his own, as we saw throughout the Gospels. Jesus walked everywhere. He didn't run. We didn't see he ran. He wasn't like running everywhere. He wasn't hurried. And more than that, Jesus, he spent all of his time with 12 people when there was crowds following him. Wouldn't it have been more effective and more productive and more efficient had Jesus actually done the Sermon on the Mount like 15 times over? Like he should have done more of those things. He should have spoken to the crowds a lot more than at least what's recorded in the Gospels. But I think what we see in the Gospels, we see Jesus as someone to emulate. We see Jesus as someone who is unhurried, who is a little bit boring, per se. We know he's done miracles and everything, but again, those were spread out over 3 years, and his life wasn't even just 3 years, it was 33 years. Jesus didn't exactly have the most exciting life, maybe more than others, but just keeping that in mind as we kind of go forward, that Jesus, he was a little bit boring, and that's okay. It's okay to be boring, because boring doesn't mean invaluable. Boring doesn't mean unimportant. Boring doesn't mean a bad thing necessarily. It started to become a bad thing when it started referring to this tool. And people said, I don't like doing that. I don't want to do that. That's boring because of something that happened around that time. But even if God is boring, is there anything really wrong with that? Is God less godly simply because he doesn't meet our standards of productivity and efficiency? Is he less godly because Jesus walked everywhere he went rather than pick up the pace and do a slight jog? Is he less godly because he spent 40 days in the wilderness as soon as he was filled with the Holy Spirit on his own personal Pentecost Sunday? Was he less godly because he didn't hop right to it and use that immediately? Like, hey, you just got filled with the Holy Spirit. Like, you should go. You should start going and doing things. Like, this is fresh. You're probably the most passionate and fired up right now, aren't you, Jesus? But he goes and takes 40 days in the wilderness and does nothing. He doesn't even eat. He fasts. He does nothing in the wilderness. He doesn't meet our modern standards of this. But here's what I think. God is boring, and he actually wants us to be boring. But not so in like this uninteresting sense, but in terms of achievement and optics, like looking exciting. So I want you to say this in the chat so everyone can hear. This is the title of today's message. It's Be Boring. Be boring. You can tell somebody that in the chat right now. Maybe you know someone. Don't tag anyone who's actually boring or anything like that. Or if they are, that's okay. But just say "be boring" in the chat. That's the title of today's message. But I want to start talking about possibly and arguably the most boring person in the entire Bible. We're going to look at a man. His name was Moses. His name was Moses. And maybe you look at Moses and you're like, how can he be the most boring? Like, there's 4 books in the Bible devoted to like what Moses did in his kind of life and works and what he did. I will say in response that 2 of those was Leviticus and Numbers. So you can read those for yourself and kind of make your own judgment. But there was Exodus and Deuteronomy as well that, yes, they were exciting in their stories in there. But as we'll see, Moses, his life was a little bit boring. Moses, he had been known by the time he was 80. He was the age of 80 when he had kind of seen the burning bush and was called by God to release the Israelites from slavery and lead them out of Egypt. He was 80 at that time. By the time he was 80, the only thing that he was known for was murdering somebody. It was the only thing that Moses was even known for. That was the only thing that he had really even achieved. He murdered somebody. And then he left to Midian, to a place called Midian, which I think is funny because it just sounds like medium. It's average. It's median. It's the middle. It's Midian. He goes to Midian, and then after that, he's called by God to release the Israelites, and then he leads them out of Egypt. He leads 2 million people out of slavery, and then goes into the wilderness for 40 years. He's in the wilderness. So this is Moses. This is his life. He has kind of like this 15 minutes of fame and like kind of notoriety and excitingness where he releases the Egyptians from Egypt and kind of leads them in that. But even then, it's not the most exciting. He didn't even do most of the talking. Aaron, his brother, did most of the talking because Moses was sluggish in speech, as some translations say. He didn't even have the most exciting speech. Moses wasn't a very exciting person. He wasn't maybe a charismatic personality. Yet we look at him, and he split the Red Sea, and he drowned like an entire army of Egyptians. But most of his life was lived in obscurity. And he did this in the mundane in Midian. He did that in the mundane in Midian, and he worked a job, he had a family, he tended to sheep, and he lived a life until he was 80, where he was the master of the mundane. And Moses, he even confesses in Exodus 4 that his speech isn't very exciting. He confessed that. He knew that about himself. Like, he knew he wasn't a very exciting person. He knew he was a little bit boring. And maybe that's not a bad thing. Perhaps it's even a good thing. And maybe it's even God's desire for us. So at the height of the action in Moses' life, we see a reminder that it's not about the action. We see this in Exodus 14. You may know the story, but I'm going to catch you up a bit if you haven't heard it yet. So Moses, he was called by God to lead the Israelites out of slavery into the promised land, but the Pharaoh would not let him go. He would not let him take the Israelites, these 2 million people who were in slavery. He wouldn't let them go. But then there was the 10 plagues that were sent to try to convince Pharaoh to let the people go and to show God and who he was. And God is this powerful person who is leading the Israelites. That was the purpose of those 10 plagues. And then they end up leaving, convince the Pharaoh, but then Pharaoh's army pursues them to the Red Sea, and they're cornered at the edge of the Red Sea, and the Israelites, they're absolutely terrified. They don't know where to go. They don't know what's going to happen. And they begin to mock Moses for sealing their fate, for seemingly doing nothing and saying, "Why have you led us here? What have you even been doing, Moses? What is going on? Why are we here?" And Aaron, he had even been the one speaking eloquently, and people looked to him for leadership. He was the spokesperson. So to the people, it wasn't even clear that Moses was really doing a whole lot. It's not surprising that following this, as soon as they cross the other side and Moses goes up on a mountain to write the 10 Commandments, that the people say, "We don't know what's going on with Moses. We don't know what he's doing. He's doing it again. He's not doing anything. He's being boring. Aaron, please help us out." And then we get the golden calf. You can read that later on in Exodus. But it's not surprising that they turn to Aaron for some action. Anyways, in Exodus 14, this is what Moses said in response to the Israelites when they're at the edge of the Red Sea. It says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Don't be afraid. Stand firm and see the Lord's salvation that he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you must be quiet.'" You must be quiet. Some translations say, "You need only be still." I don't know about you, but like Moses, he knew silence and stillness. He practiced that for 80 years. And I don't know if I can think of anything more boring than being still. Like try to be still for the rest of this message. For the next 13 or so minutes, just try to be still where you're watching at home. Be perfectly still. Don't move your hand or itch or do anything. Don't get more comfortable or anything like that. Just be still. And try that. It's got to be one of the most boring things that you could do. But try to stay still if you can. And I believe the most difficult thing that we can really do is be boring. It's not actually to be more productive, but to be boring is probably even more difficult. Because I think we need to rebrand boring, and this word boring that we're talking about today, and take all the pressures off of ourselves and say it's okay to live this, it's not okay, or we don't have to live this exciting, this adventurous, this flashy, Instagram-worthy life that's consumed with productivity. Rather, we live a life like Moses, minus the murder, of course, live a life like Moses, and that is spent on caring for others, doing honest good work, raising a family. You don't have to raise a family, but that was what Moses did. And being still. And being still. What if God isn't calling us to change the world? What if God is just calling us to be a good neighbor? What if God isn't calling us to do a lot of things for him and about him and all these things, but he's calling us to become like Jesus? I believe that God, he wants to break down some misconceptions about himself today. God is not a taskmaster. God does not have this endless list of to-dos for us to do and says, "Here you go, make sure you do them all, just keep working your way through it and see how many you can check off." He has a list of things that we should be. You can check Galatians 5 for those, but here they are for you right now. He says we should be loving, to be joyful, to be peaceful, be patient, be kind, be good, be faithful, be gentle, and be self-controlled. And those things don't necessarily require a big list of actions. It's something we're to become. And they certainly require some action at some point. But the purpose and the focus is to become like Jesus, to become like these things that are of God. So we look at this wood and this boring tool. I think what happens to us sometimes is that we say, I don't want this. I don't like this thing. I don't want this thing called a boring tool. I don't want that. We say, I want to keep it a little bit more exciting. We say, I want a little bit more power. I want some action. I want some action. I want things to get a little bit more intense here. So we say, I want to make things a little more exciting, like just make them a little bit different. So we say, I want to go on vacations. And there's nothing wrong with vacations. There's absolutely nothing wrong with vacations. But we say, I want a vacation. So we say, I'm going to put some vacations in my life. I might take one a year. I want to make sure that sometimes I go camping. Maybe sometimes I go to Bermuda or somewhere. I want to go somewhere tropical. And we say, I want something exciting. We say, yeah, nice. I want that. I'm going to have that. I'm going to add that to my life. But then we say, I want to add some renos. I want to add some reno. I want to really excite my life. And we're in the middle of doing renos at our house too, which is fine. I know lots of people are because real estate's crazy right now, all right? So we say, I want to add some renos. And there's nothing wrong with renos. I'm telling you right now, I'm not saying that facetiously. There's actually nothing wrong with renos. But we say, we're not doing anything right now, so let's renovate. Let's do something else. We say, okay, good, sweet. We added some more things. But then we say, I want to get together with some people. I want to get together with other people. We want to make sure, like that one family, we want to get together with them pretty consistently. So let's make sure we have them over. Obviously, COVID restrictions and all that, make sure do that safely. Maybe it's after COVID or anything. But you probably have a list of people even right now. Like, hey, when COVID's over, we're going to have them over. We're going to make sure we prioritize that, have them over like every night of the week. Same with that family, that family, that family. And maybe you want to do that. We're all going to be starving for that. So we're going to start filling up our schedules a lot more, especially once things open up, hopefully on Tuesday, but we'll see. We're not holding out for it. But we say, we want to put some of those things on there. So we have that, and then we say, okay, I want to add some more things. What else can I add? I want to make sure I go to the gym. I want to make sure we can be able to afford that new John Deere tractor, like spring's coming. So we want to make sure that lawn is looking nice. So we're going to add that in here, and we're going to say, we want to make sure that lawn's looking nice because you know what? Grass grows, it happens, but when it does, we want to make sure it looks nice. So we add that in there and we say, okay, great. This is my life. I'm going to see if I want to add my kid. I'm going to make sure we can enroll my kids in some extracurriculars and things and have them in things. So our schedule's nice and full. People have things going on. We have this exciting life. We have that. But then, here's what happens, is we look at this life that we've built for ourselves and we say, okay, well, we need to make sure we have work that pays well, that's something we enjoy, and we want to have this job that pays well. It's likely we're going to require some extra training, so I might need to do that at home or some extra certification in the evenings or anything, kind of on my own time. And then I want to make sure I get that promotion. I want to have a job that pays well, that can afford this life that I've kind of built for myself. But here's what happens, is God says, I want you to be boring. I want to be boring into your life. I want to be creating depth in your life. I didn't ask you to do a bunch of things. I didn't ask you to do things, to be someone who can do all these things. What I asked you is to be someone, to become like Jesus. He wants to form us. And you see, when we have all these things, we say, well, I can't really become something if all these things are in the way. God can't do that work of creating depth in our lives, which happens in the mundane in Midian that Moses experienced. It happens when things aren't flashy, that aren't super exciting or adventurous. It happens when things are a bit more boring. Now, I don't know if we need to understand this about the word boring this morning. I didn't quite get into it. But this became the word boring in 1768. And I don't know if you know what else happened in the late 1700s. It was a little something called the Industrial Revolution. And when the Industrial Revolution happened, things like this boring tool became boring because they were slow, they were tedious, they were boring. People didn't want to do that anymore. They wanted fast, efficient, productive. How can we speed things up? How can we make things more effective? Before the Industrial Revolution, boring wasn't an option because people were busy working jobs. People were busy just trying to secure food for their family. Boring wasn't an option because there was plenty of things to do that were necessities that needed to be done. Boring then became a luxury at that point. But this has continued to form us into what we see in our culture today, where we have an obsession with productivity and efficiency and achievement, and it keeps us overstimulated to keep us dialed in 24/7. What we think is productive may actually be destructive. And like any good vehicle, the harder you drive it, the more you drive it, it's gonna deteriorate more quickly over time. But I want to look at quickly in the Hebrews. If you look in Hebrews 11, there's this passage called the Hall of Faith, and you see a list of people there. It says these people are filled with faith. But I want you to notice something in that chapter today when you go home and read it afterwards or anything, that in Hebrews 11, all these things, it's all people who are faithful and were a little bit boring. And I love how it starts with the Genesis, talks about the creation, because God set the precedent, and he said on the seventh day, I'm going to take a Sabbath. I'm going to take a rest. God set precedent for us. And then we see these other maybe not so interesting characters who are a little bit boring. It says Enoch. Enoch, we literally know nothing about him. There's like one verse, but it mentions him again in Hebrews 11 as someone who's filled with faith. And it says he fathered sons and daughters and walked with God. That's what we know about Enoch. He fathered sons and daughters and walked with God for 365 years. He was a bit boring. Noah built a boat for decades without modern construction tools. He probably had something like this, or maybe worse. He had one of those. Abraham, he was promised descendants as numerous as the stars and didn't even have a biological child until he was 100 years old. Yet, he waited for 25 years for that miracle to come to pass, and then he didn't even see the promise fulfilled. He only had one son. That's all he had. And then we see Moses, we already talked about him. And then Jericho, the Israelites, they simply marched around a city and they let God do the work. They just marched around the city for 7 days. Again, not exactly the most exciting or interesting thing. There was some trumpets, so it added a little bit of action. But what if we need to return to the things we once called boring and find the meaning in the mundane? Jefferson Bethke is the author of a book called To Hell with the Hustle. I hope I can say hell, but I said hell, I'm sorry. But says that the goal of following Jesus isn't to do a bunch of things. It's to become a type of person. He later says in his book, to follow Jesus, we need to not just follow his teaching, but also follow his way, his process, his cadence, his demeanor, his spirit, his very essence. You see, Jesus was never rushed. Jesus was never just checking off a to-do list. He wasn't trying to do everything for everyone. He wasn't trying to fill his schedule like we see here. But in order for us to become like that, we need to deconstruct a little bit. I know faith deconstruction is a little bit more of a trendy thing these days that we need to talk about. I think we need to talk a little bit about how we might need to deconstruct some of the things we've built into our lives. And we might need to take those things out. And it might take a little bit of time. It might take some time to recognize those things that you need to cut out, but what we need to do is clear some space to allow us to be boring, to allow God to be boring into us. We need to deconstruct these things that we said, I need to do this, I need to be effective, I need to be productive, I need to be able to do all of these things. And we need to be able to kind of clear off a little bit of real estate for God to work, clear off some space so that God can take his boring tool, his Holy Spirit, into our lives and begin boring. And he wants to bore into us because what he wants to do is create depth in our lives. He wants to create depth in you. He wants to create character. He wants to produce these things. He wants you to be boring. And he wants you to develop these things like love and joy and patience and kindness and goodness and self-control. And I'm not going to lie, some of those things, it comes when things are in the mundane. It comes when you have people in your life that you're just like, I'm not sure how to handle this. It comes when you're just working a job that you're not really sure what to do. And it might be a little bit boring. It might be not super exciting all the time. God didn't promise us an exciting life. He promised us a fulfilling life. And that comes with something it calls with faithfulness. And God is going to be working in us in those faithful moments where we are simply just turning the crank, where we're simply just living our life. We're just going about our days. We're doing the regular things that we always do. Maybe it is taking the kids to soccer practice, but we need to really decide what is the life that we're trying to build. And is that allowing us to become like Jesus? I'm not saying today that you can't do anything. I'm not saying that you have to do a life where you do absolutely nothing. But I am saying that we need to simplify in order for us to allow God to work in us to help us become like Jesus. And we need to leave a little bit of margin in order for us to do that. But I want you to ask yourself, are you boring? Are you boring? When's the last time that you allowed God to fight your battles? When's the last time you did that? Instead of you stepping in and trying to fix everything, instead of you coming and saying, I need to fix these things. I need to fix this problem. Like my kids, I need to step in and I need to fix them. Or I need to fix my spouse. I need to come in and I need to fix my job. I need to fix things. You're not Mr. Fix-It. So let's just get rid of that off the table. You're not Mr. Fix-It, but we can't be so eager to jump in. So step aside and allow God to actually renovate your heart, because he wants to be boring into you. He wants to renovate you. He wants to work in you. So we need to keep this in mind. It's about following Jesus. It's about becoming. It's not about producing. What we call boring is often when God is boring into us. That's when he's boring and creating depth in our lives. It's where God is working, creating depth of character for us, like Moses in the mundane of Midian. So I have 3 challenges for us to kind of take this and get rid of the need to achieve, to produce, and to do. Are you ready? We're going to do these 3 challenges really quick. And you can take this and you can do whatever you want with it. But I want to leave you with 3 challenges, and they're kind of sequential. They're kind of go in order. So if you take the first step, the first challenge, you can take the second, but you can't necessarily take the second without doing the first. Okay, so here's the first one. Here's the first challenge. Do nothing for a day. Do nothing for a day, and make that every week. The Bible calls this thing called a Sabbath. And we've forgotten this in our lives, that the Sabbath isn't a suggestion. It's a commandment. The Sabbath is a commandment. Sabbath is not God's idea of a break. Sabbath is God's design for productivity. It's actually God's way of allowing us to rest and restore so that we can actually be more productive the next day. But we need to take a break. When you look at the Sabbath, it says there in the Exodus when they were picking up manna and bread from the ground, they said, God will actually give you more the day before so you don't have to, or he will give you more the day before so that you don't have to store it up. Like he will actually provide for you. He will actually provide for you what you need. And he did that in Exodus as well. But God did this in Genesis as well to set precedent. But here's what we do. If you took some soil and like a plant, you took some soil and you want to plant a seed in it, we take that and we put the seed in there and we water it, we prep the soil, we do that, and we say, okay, I want to see this plant grow. And when you do that, what we want to do is we want to look in there and see, where's the growth? Is there roots being formed yet? Is there anything happening? Is there any action? What's going on? We say, okay, maybe if we water it more, let's try to do something else to try to make this seed grow. What else can we do? Maybe we can add some fertilizer on top. Maybe we need to change up the soil. Let's put the seed in different soil. Maybe we need to just change things up here. How can we allow this seed to grow? What can we do to make the seed grow? When in reality, all you need to do is prepare the soil, plant the seed, and water it, and God's going to make it grow. But we need to step aside. We need to stop doing, and try to be productive and efficient, because what that's doing, it's not allowing anything to happen. Nothing's happening, because God didn't create you as someone to do a ton of things and be productive and efficient. He created you as someone to become like Jesus, to become a beautiful plant that he wants to grow and develop. It's not about doing a ton of things. It's about being. It's about becoming like Jesus. But some things aren't in your control, so we need to relinquish that control and allow God to grow. But Sabbath is our reminder that God is in control, and the world will keep spinning even when we stop working. So take a day, take 24 hours, take that every week and make it your Sabbath and do nothing. Even with History Maker this past weekend, it kind of threw off our Sabbath routine. We said, you know what? We got a day tomorrow. We got a stat tomorrow. We got a long weekend. So we're taking Monday and we're saying that's our 24 hours. We need that this week. So we're taking tomorrow as our Sabbath, because that's a priority for us in our family right now. And I want to encourage you, we all have a day off tomorrow. We all have a day off this May long weekend. You have a day off tomorrow. Maybe you're working, and I'm sorry about that, but I would encourage you to prioritize that and take a day, take 24 hours where you do not produce. This is a recreational day, hence recreation. You're recreating. Do all your chores before and after. Don't do them on the day. Press pause on renos and projects, all that stuff. Just get off your device even if you need to. That's something we do. Make the day about reconnecting with God and relinquishing control. Because you'll find that when you relinquish control, the world's going to keep spinning. Your world will keep spinning. But you need to relinquish control. God isn't necessarily going to do your dishes or anything. I want you to keep that in mind. I want to promise that. But this is reminding us that following Jesus is about becoming, not about doing. Here's the second challenge. Feel boredom. feel that. Maybe you said that before. You said, I feel bored. That's not what I'm talking about. I mean, like, sit in that a bit longer. Being bored isn't a bad thing. Being bored and boredom can actually be a catalyst for creativity. It can actually be a catalyst for you to have new ideas. It can actually be an opportunity for you to meditate on the Word of God. It can actually be an opportunity for you to spend time talking with God. Instead of trying to fill your space, your head with music or a podcast or a new TV show playing in the background or anything, just sit in that and be bored. Maybe you're just doing the dishes and you're like, this is boring. How about you spend that time just praying with God? Spend that time just talking to Him. Spend that time meditating on His Word. And you will actually feel a closer relationship with God because He'll be boring into you. He'll be helping you become more like Jesus. He'll be creating depth in your life. And you will only feel bored of if you've committed to stop filling up your life with tasks, project, and activity. We are overstimulated in Western civilization, and to tap into God's design for Sabbath, we need to dial back that stimuli. We need to dial it back. Here's a third challenge. It's more of a statement, but take it as a challenge. Repetition creates depth. Like that boring tool, spinning again and again, repetition creates depth. Just like this boring tool, God has a boring tool. God uses the boring, the everyday, the mundane, the monotonous, the tediously repetitive tasks that our lives are filled with to shape us, to form us, to make us like Jesus. And when we're able to recognize that a life following Jesus isn't some flashy highlight reel, but rather a faithful consistency, we will discover the beauty in the boring. Lastly, before we head off to our post-show, the writer of Ecclesiastes, often thought to be King Solomon, really sums it up well when he says this in chapter 3, verses 9 to 14. He had experienced the ultimate highlight reel. He had experienced everything under the sun. He experienced it all. He was overstimulated, and this is what he said as he reflects back on his life. He says, what does the worker gain from his struggles? That's a rhetorical question. You don't gain anything. Verse 10, I have seen the task that God has given the children of Adam to keep them occupied. He has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also put eternity, as in a never-ending list of accomplishments and things that they could do. He has put eternity in their hearts, but no one can discover the work that God has done from beginning to end. So, I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and enjoy the good life. It is also the gift of God whenever anyone eats, drinks, and enjoys all his efforts. All means doing the dishes. All means driving around on a long commute. All means doing anything and everything, okay? As in embracing the toil, the boring. And I know that, and he says this in verse 14, I know that everything God does will last forever. There is no adding to it or taking from it. So don't think that your productivity, you're going to add a ton of value or anything like that. God is saying there is no adding to it or taking from it. You cannot outwork our God, so stop acting like you can. God works so that people will be in awe of Him. God works so that people will be in awe of Him, and that is what the Sabbath is all about. It's all taking a step back and saying, not looking and say, hey, look at all I did this week. It's saying, look at all that God is doing. Look at all that God is doing around us. Look at all that God has done. It's about us marveling at Him and His good works and what He is doing around us. So I want to encourage you today, be boring. It's really not as bad as it sounds. In fact, it's better than trying to be exciting. Let me pray for us as we end. God, I thank you for each and every single person who's here today. I pray that you would be speaking to them through your Holy Spirit, that whether they're listening after the fact on a podcast or they're watching this later on, that God, that you would be speaking to them right now about the things that they maybe need to drop from their lives and how you are currently working in their life, that you are boring into them in those menial, mundane tasks that are happening around them, that they would embrace those things as an opportunity for them to grow in their character, for them to grow in their spirit, in their relationship with you. So God, would you be working in our lives this week and this weekend, God, as we finish off May long weekend, would you give people opportunity to breathe, to take a rest, to Sabbath. God, we love you. We thank you for this opportunity, for today, this message you've laid on our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. We're going to go to the post show in a bit, but I want to say first that I want to thank every single person that you are a part of what God is doing here in Chilliwack. You are a part of what God is doing here across BC and Canada, thankfully, because of all the great things that we were able to produce and provide here through this live stream, this live experience that we're able to offer. And this can only happen because of those who have faithfully given. And even if you haven't faithfully given, maybe you haven't offered any money or done anything, that's okay. We're glad that you're able to be a part of this as well. We have lots of people who give of their time, of their efforts and resources, but I want to thank you, those who specifically have given financially. If you'd like to partner with us, partner with what God is doing here and the work we're doing here in this city and across this country, we want to ask that we would just invite you to give at firstave.org/give. It's kind of an opportunity for you to do that. If you live in town, you can always drop by our office and drop off your giving that way as well. I want to thank you all for being with us today. Thank you for tuning in. I want to encourage you, if there's someone you feel like needs to hear this message, you share that with them. And hopefully that would even just multiply how God wants to speak to his people today. We love you. We're going to head over to our post show with Gavin and Rebecca right now. Enjoy.